When it comes to how we see ourselves, how accurate are our perceptions? How do we know if we see ourselves clearly or not? Most people are average. You, me, and probably every person you've ever met would fall within the statistical bell curve of averageness, and this is totally normal and acceptable. In statistics, this is known as normal distribution, and it looks like this. The majority of the population, 68% to be exact, are somewhere within the middle of the bell on either side of the mean score within one standard deviation. One standard deviation below the mean is 34% of the population, and one standard deviation above the mean score is 34% of the population. If we use IQ, or intelligence, as an example of this rule of averageness, we can see that most people have IQ scores somewhere between 85 and 115, which are plus or minus one standard deviation of the mean score of 100 IQ points. I know that I am statistically average because my IQ score is 114 points when I do the test. It's above the mean score of the population, but it is still average. People who score way above the average are known as outliers. It is statistically improbable to be in this category. There is nothing wrong with averageness. It's totally normal. It's statistically normal. It doesn't stop people from doing amazing things with their lives, striving to push their limits, creating meaningful relationships, and exploring the wonders of this world. However, there is a phenomenon discovered by psychology research team Dunning and Kruger, published in 1999, where the bottom 16% of any given population believe they fall into the top 16% of the population. In other words, they believe that they are statistical outliers, which is statistically improbable. Most of the population is not that awesome. This delusional self-concept is known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. So how do you know if it's happening to you? Well, the biggest problem with the Dunning-Kruger effect is that the people who are affected by it legitimately don't know that they're not that awesome. So why does this occur? How can people be so out of touch with reality? Well, it comes back to that famous saying, the more you know you don't know. This is sometimes attributed to Aristotle, but there's no evidence that he wrote this line. However, the anonymous quote is fairly apt for this situation. In essence, it means that people who don't know enough to realize how little they actually know will be able to delude themselves into thinking they're an expert. If you think about it, this could go horribly wrong. Imagine someone throwing in their career and family, moving to Hollywood hoping to make it big in acting because they think they're amazing, but they're actually terrible. This is why there are so many funny clips of people auditioning for talent shows unironically. They don't know that they're bad at something. They think they're great at it. How do people arrive at such incorrect conclusions about themselves? Usually it's because they have used a faulty line of reasoning, such as can be seen in syllogisms. Syllogism is something Aristotle actually is responsible for, and it's a fancy word for deductive reasoning. This is where someone takes a combination of two premises and draws a conclusion from that combination. In order for a categorical syllogism to be a valid line of deductive reasoning, it has to hold up to scrutiny, and this is where we can see the Dunning-Kruger flaw of logic play out. The basic formula of a categorical syllogism is this. Premise 1, all A's are B's. Premise 2, all B's are C's. Conclusion, all A's are C's. And you can see an example of this with all birds are animals. All animals eat, therefore all birds eat. Or another example, all birds are animals. All animals have 4 legs, therefore all birds have 4 legs. Now, in the rules of syllogisms, both of these are valid lines of reasoning. The fact that one of them is incorrect is irrelevant. In syllogisms, validity is not the same thing as facts. A line of reasoning can be valid without actually being factual. Human beings often believe that they're logical, but strong evidence would suggest that common sense is not that common. So how do we know when we're not implementing sense. Let's have a look at another example of a real-world syllogism. In this situation, we can assume from premise number 1 and premise number 2, all Griffith students live on the Gold Coast, all pro surfers live on the Gold Coast. Therefore, all Griffith students are pro surfers. Now, is this true? I lived on the Gold Coast and I went to Griffith University, and I can tell you now, most people are not pro surfers, even though there are pro surfing beaches there. So let's revise our syllogism a little. Now, instead of saying all, we can just say some, and then it might be true, but the thing is, now it's no longer a valid syllogism. The line of reasoning is flawed because it's only some, it's not all. And this is one of the biggest problems with logic and reasoning, because you can have a valid line of logic which actually isn't true, and you can have an invalid line of logic which is true. So how do you develop a realistic self-concept so that you don't end up going surfing thinking that you're a pro surfer just because you live on the Gold Coast and end up wiping out? We all know those people who think that they could coach pro football just because they watch it on TV. And we all know those people who keep trying to relive the glory days as though they're still 20 years old and fit as a fiddle, or still young and gorgeous. In her book Insight, psychologist Dr. Tasha Eurich found in her research that, contrary to claims made by previous psychology researchers in the 1980s, which was then debunked by the work of Dunning-Kruger, people with a distorted sense of their own abilities are not happier. Instead, they tend more towards anxiety and have more cases of depression than people who are able to recognize their own ordinariness. By contrast, researchers found that people who have accurate perceptions of their own abilities are happier, content with themselves but continually seeking to improve, and can extend patience and forgiveness towards other people when they fail. People who are real experts tend to estimate their own abilities lower than the people who are nowhere near their high levels, because they always see room for improvement and maintain a willingness to learn and grow. They often come to this moderate sense of self through attempting to learn more or putting themselves to the test. When they discover how truly difficult something is, or find out how much there is to learn within a particular field of expertise, it forces them to change their perception of themselves. So how does a delusional self-concept make someone prone to depression and anxiety? Surely being blissfully unaware of your own inadequacies would be great. The payoff is they get to protect their egos with a layer of unconscious self-delusion. But the cost is they cannot genuinely progress towards excellence because they will not receive negative feedback. Their identity and core sense of self is constantly under threat from reality, and the only way to control the threat is to avoid learning or being tested, which means they cannot grow. Their identity has been built around out-of-date information or hyperinflated and untested ideas about who they really are, usually as a defense mechanism for being ordinary, because they're afraid that being normal equals being unworthy of love and acceptance. Often this toxic messaging stems from their parents or other influential adults when they were growing up. Because of this, they have trouble forgiving themselves when reality hits and contradicts the idealized self. When they attempt to self-reflect, it ends up turning into rumination on their failures, with no option of improvement and a plethora of self-recrimination. Given this catastrophizing of reality, it's easy to see why they avoid it at all costs. Depression has a variety of causes, including chemical disturbances and overwhelming circumstances, like chronic health problems. Depression from rumination is preventable if you can recognize maladaptive coping strategies which cause problems rather than solving them. Not everything is within your control, and being at peace with that is important, but some things are up to you, and it's equally important to focus your attention on those areas. Ruminating is not what most people think it is. Many assume that it's when someone is too hard on themselves and they beat themselves up, but the reality is it's actually very self-indulgent. Rather than learning from mistakes, making corrections, and realizing that they can't change the past but they can prevent it from happening again, people wallow in self-pity and glory in their own martyrdom. It's not productive, it's not mature, and it does not count towards becoming a functional adult. That probably sounds too harsh to someone who wants pity instead of empowerment. I already beat myself up enough without you doing it too, they might say. But this fixation on regret instead of progress is being harsh on themselves in the most futile and unproductive manner possible. It's also selfish, because while they wallow, everyone else has to pick up the pieces for them and prop up their sad sack ego. Not okay. Instead, they need to learn how to be hard on themselves in a way which is constructive rather than destructive. They need to learn the discipline of realizing everything about their future is up to them and being humble enough to put in the effort, time, endurance, sacrificing comfort, and seeking advice and feedback from others. As it says in Proverbs 12:15, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he who heeds counsel is wise. And Proverbs 13:11, wealth gained hastily will dwindle, but whoever gathers little by little will increase it. Persistence, patience, hard work, and sensible planning are the hallmarks of people who actually have something to show years later. Proverbs repeatedly says that wisdom is all about diligence. He who has a slack hand becomes poor, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. The soul of a lazy man desires and has nothing, but the soul of the diligent shall be made rich. This is not only about practicality, but it's also about integrity. So foolishness is defined in the Bible as the inability to heed advice, to externalize blame for mistakes rather than taking responsibility, and constantly seeking the easy way through life. The fool resists the wisdom of God in favor of their own wisdom. These types of people often find themselves in a stalemate with God, where they might hear the gospel of Jesus as savior of the failed state of humanity, but they won't accept that they are one of the people in need of saving, because their self-concept tells them that they're better than others and cannot be criticized. Otherwise, they would become beyond redemption. They must be perfect, or else. These are the people unironically auditioning for heaven by trying to insist before God that he's a fool not to recognize how awesome they are. Unfortunately, when they arrive at Judgment Day, Jesus might say to them, "I never knew you." This is why Proverbs says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." In order to receive salvation, we have to understand and accept our own failures and shortcomings. Otherwise, we won't have an accurate perception of how far we have fallen from the gold standard set by God at the beginning. When we see how much we need God's help and forgiveness, we become open to constructive feedback and teaching, which leads to the development of wisdom. Continually learning from our mistakes and knowing our limitations produces humility and a forgiving nature towards others' struggles. It does not lead to being holier than thou, even if they actually are living on the straight and narrow path set by Jesus. When you do challenging things outside of your comfort zone, you begin to view yourself as capable. This doesn't mean you're an automatic expert, it just means that you start to believe that you can find solutions and be proactive in life, including times when random situations are thrown at you, forcing you to adapt and grow. Jesus himself continuously extended grace to people who had previously failed miserably in life, not because he had ever fallen short himself, but because he saw their willingness to learn and grow. He knew those were people who would blossom in his care and soak up the living water to produce fruit. This is why it says in James, "God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble." The human urge to preserve our egos at the cost of salvation is a very large stumbling block for many people. The crucial step through the narrow gate is to realize that we have not, in fact, nailed it. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time.